They came for me on a Tuesday morning while I was still in my pajamas. Two men in blue uniforms knocked on my front door, and before I could ask a single question, they had soft restraints around my wrists. I screamed. I twisted my body and dug my heels into the floor, but they were bigger and there were two of them. My mother stood on the porch holding a thick folder of papers. Her hands trembled slightly, but her eyes never wavered. "She's been unstable for months," she told the men in a calm practice voice, like she had rehearsed it 100 times. I begged her to stop. I told her I had done nothing wrong. Nobody looked at me. As they pushed me into the back of a white transport van, I turned and looked through the rear window. My Uncle Warren was already inside my home, sitting at my dining table like he already owned every inch of it. The door slammed shut. I had been legally erased. The facility was called Crestwood Private Care Center. It looked clean and calm from the outside: white walls, flower beds along the entrance path, a soft-lettered sign near the gate. But when they sat me down at the intake desk and slid a stack of documents across the table, the calmness became something else entirely. I demanded to see the paperwork. A nurse with a tight bun and tired eyes looked somewhere past my shoulder. A doctor in a white coat walked in and announced that I had been voluntarily admitted by next of kin. I went completely still. That phrase meant someone had signed on my behalf. I pulled the top sheet toward me. My full name was printed in clean black ink. Ivy Cade. But the handwriting was wrong. It was too thin, too slanted. I would never write my own name like that. Underneath, in bold blue ink, was my mother's signature approving everything. The room seemed to tilt. Someone had been forging my name for months, and no one here had even blinked. 3 days into my confinement, I overheard two staff members talking through the crack of an open door. They were preparing notes for my first therapy session. I caught fragments: violent episode, threatened her cousin, and family deeply concerned. I pressed myself against the corridor wall and focused on breathing slowly. I had never threatened my cousin Amber. I had never even raised my voice at her. That night, lying on a stiff mattress and staring at the ceiling, I replayed the last family dinner in my mind. It had been 6 weeks before the 1-year anniversary of my father's death, and my mother had insisted I attend. Looking back, the whole evening had felt rehearsed. Everyone watched me without appearing to watch. At some point, someone refilled my glass without asking. I remembered thinking nothing of it at the time. But lying there in that small room with its single locked window, I recalled how the water had tasted strange. Slightly bitter. A little too sweet underneath. Like something had been added without my knowledge. On my 5th day, a nurse named Kim left my patient file open on the table, while she stepped out to take a phone call. I had only seconds. I leaned forward and read as quickly as my eyes could move. There were the usual intake notes: sleep patterns, meal records, response to staff. But near the bottom of the second page, stamped in dark red ink, were 4 words I had never seen on a medical document before. Asset protection review pending. My stomach dropped. I had worked in finance long enough to understand that phrase completely. It had nothing to do with health or treatment. It was a legal and financial term used when someone's property or holdings were being assessed for transfer or takeover. I was not inside this facility because my family was worried about me. I was here because I controlled my father's shares in Cade Investment Group. I stood between my Uncle Warren and a fortune worth millions. This had never been about my mental health. This had always been about money. I kept replaying the day the will was read. It was a gray October afternoon, 3 months after my father, George Cade, died of a sudden heart attack. His lawyer, a steady, careful man named Stuart Clifton, sat at the head of a long conference table and read each line slowly. My mother and Uncle Warren sat on one side. I sat directly across from them. When Stuart reached the section about controlling shares in Cade Investment Group, the atmosphere in the room shifted. He announced that my father had chosen to leave full controlling interest to me, his only child. I watched my uncle's face in that exact moment. 1 second it held polite expectation. The next, all expression drained from it completely. Not sadness, not surprise, but a cold, clean blankness, like a shutter falling behind his eyes. My mother reached beneath the table and pressed her hand against his arm without a word. They had expected a different outcome entirely. In the silence that followed the reading, I believe their plan was already beginning to form. By my second week, I understood that my isolation was not accidental. Every phone I attempted to access was restricted to staff use only. Each time I asked about visitor rights, I was told my family had requested a recovery period, with no outside contact. When I asked which family member had made that specific request, no one gave me a direct answer. Staff rotations also felt deliberate. The nurses who showed even a trace of sympathy, a slightly longer pause, a softer tone, disappeared from my ward within 24 hours and were replaced. The only consistent presence was Nurse Caldwell, a tall, sharp-eyed woman with a clipped way of speaking. She never smiled. She documented every word I said during daily check-ins with a speed that felt practiced rather than routine. I noticed she never left notes on the shared staff board as the others did. Hers went straight into a sealed folder. Someone on the outside was receiving regular updates about me. I was not being treated. I was being monitored. His name was Pete. I learned that gradually. At first, I only knew him as the janitor who mopped the east hallway every morning around 6. He was a thin, older man with a slow, steady walk and a habit of humming quietly to himself. He never made eye contact with patients. But on my 14th morning as I passed him in the corridor, I felt something press into my palm. A small folded piece of paper, no larger than a matchbook. I kept walking. I waited until I was back inside my room before I opened it. 3 lines written in careful small letters. I believe you. I have seen this before. Do not trust Nurse Caldwell. I sat on the edge of my bed and read it 4 times. Something cracked open in my chest. Not hope exactly, but the solid, grounding feeling that I was still real. That someone inside these walls could see clearly what was happening to me. I folded the note tightly and pressed it deep into the lining of my left shoe. I said nothing to anyone. During my 3rd week, a different nurse left a printed summary sheet in the common area by mistake. It was addressed to the facility's financial liaison. My name appeared at the top. Below it were account numbers I recognized, my personal savings, my investment holding account, and the discretionary fund my father had established in my name before he died. Beside each account was a column labeled authorization date, and next to that, one labeled transfer initiated. Withdrawals had been made. Large ones. The signatures authorizing each transaction were supposedly mine. I stared at my name written over and over on that page. But the details were wrong. The way the K in Kate curved was wrong. My real signature had a sharp break after the capital letter. A habit I had formed in college. These signatures were smooth and unbroken. Someone had studied my handwriting carefully enough to replicate it, but not closely enough to capture every detail. My identity was being used beyond these walls, and I was sitting locked and silent inside them, unable to say a single word. My assigned therapist was a man named Dr. Howell. He had a soft, even voice and a habit of tilting his head slightly to the left when he asked questions, a technique designed to appear open and non-threatening. During our 3rd session, he guided the conversation toward my inheritance. Some patients, he said gently, struggle to process a sudden increase in responsibility, can create feelings of paranoia, a belief that others want what they have. I told him plainly that what I believed was based on evidence, not feelings. He nodded slowly and wrote something in his notepad. Then he asked whether I sometimes felt that people close to me were conspiring against me. I told him the word conspiring implied I was imagining things. He smiled, a small patient smile that never reached his eyes. At the end of the session, he said I was making progress. I had not agreed with a single suggestion he had made. But I understood then that my diagnosis had been decided long before I ever sat down across from him. Her name was Tara Fields. We had been close friends since our mid-20s. She had worked as my father's personal assistant for 4 years, and after his death, she had stayed in regular contact with me. She was the person I called when I needed to think something through out loud. So when I found a signed statement inside my file during a brief moment alone near the nurse's station, the sight of her name at the bottom of the page landed like a blow. The statement described me as increasingly erratic, unable to manage basic responsibilities, and disconnected from reality following her father's death. It was dated 2 days before my forced admission. 2 days after Tara had visited me at home, sat in my kitchen, drank tea, and laughed with me about something small and ordinary. I had not been erratic that day. I had been completely myself. She had sat across from me, smiled and already signed that paper. It was not the words that broke something in me. It was the memory of the tea. I found it by accident. I had been pacing my room each evening as a way to keep my mind sharp. 8 steps from the door to the window, 8 steps back. On my 19th day, my foot caught the edge of the maintenance panel set low into the far corner baseboard. It shifted and pulled loose. I crouched down slowly, pretending to stretch, in case anyone was watching from the doorway. The panel was not secured. Behind it, mounted in a small bracket angled precisely toward my bed, was a compact wireless camera. It was not a standard facility security camera. Those were ceiling-mounted with visible warning stickers. This one had no markings and no visible wiring. Someone had placed it there deliberately. I pressed the panel carefully back into position, stood, and resumed pacing as though nothing had happened. My pulse was fast, but my face stayed still. Wherever that camera's recordings were being stored, it was not on the facility's own servers. It was going somewhere private, somewhere my family could access them directly. News reached me in fragments. A magazine left face up in the common room, half a sentence overheard through a cracked office door, a phone screen glimpse for 2 seconds as a staff member walked past. But over the course of a week, those fragments assembled themselves into a picture I had feared since the first day of my confinement. My Uncle Warren had taken my father's seat on the board of Cade Investment Group, not as a temporary measure, not as an informal arrangement. He had appeared before the board with documentation. I could only imagine what it contained, and argued that as next of kin in a family medical crisis, he had the legal right to assume control during my incapacity. The board had agreed. His name was now listed publicly as acting director of the firm. Mine appeared nowhere in any record. I had been removed without a fight, without a notification, and without a single word of protest, because the people who were supposed to protect my rights were the same people who had engineered my removal. Pete had been watching for his moment carefully. On my 22nd morning, he guided me with a single small nod toward the supply corridor at the back of the east wing, a narrow hallway with no ceiling cameras, a fact he appeared to know with precision. At the far end, beside a cleaning cart, was a wall-mounted phone reserved for internal maintenance calls. Pete told me I had 90 seconds before the next staff pass. I lifted the receiver and dialed a direct number from memory, Carol Baines, a legal contact from before my confinement who had once helped me with a contract matter at my father's firm. The phone rang 3 times. She answered. I stated my name clearly. Ivy Cade. The line went silent for exactly 2 full seconds. Then she hung up. No explanation, no question, no hesitation, just a clean and deliberate disconnection. I stood holding the receiver for a moment in the quiet of that corridor. Either she was afraid of someone connected to my family, or someone had already spoken to her. Either possibility told me exactly the same thing. By my 4th week, the story outside had been completely rewritten. Pete managed to slip me a torn page from a financial newspaper during a brief exchange in the common area. In the lower corner of the business section, my name appeared in a short paragraph. It described me as a grieving heir who experienced a significant mental health episode following the sudden death of her father, George Cade. It said I was receiving private care, and that family members had stepped in to manage affairs during her recovery. A quote from my Uncle Warren described the family as heartbroken and fully committed to my well-being. Every word was carefully chosen. Every phrase was shaped to sound like love. He used soft language, words like grief and fragile and concern, that made a reader feel sympathy without asking any questions. People who did not know me would read that paragraph and believe it completely. They would never think to ask who had arranged my admission, who had signed the documents, or whose name now appeared on the company records instead of mine. I had rehearsed the language of my father's will in my mind dozens of times since my admission, searching for anything I might have overlooked. Then on my 26th night it surfaced, not the full text, but the exact phrasing of Section 9. My father had been a practical man who planned carefully for every possibility. Section 9 contained a protective clause stating that if the primary beneficiary, meaning me, was ever declared legally or medically incompetent, controlling interest in Cade Investment Group would transfer immediately to the next named party, Warren Cade. But the same clause held a counter-provision. If the beneficiary could demonstrate that any declaration of incompetence had been obtained through fraud, deception, or coercion, all assets would return to her in full, with no contest permitted. My family did not need to steal from me directly. They only needed a judge's signature declaring me incapable. That single declaration was worth millions of dollars. It was the reason I was in this facility. It was the reason I could not leave. The word incompetent was their entire plan. Pete found me again 4 days later. He sat across the common room during an open hour, working his mop in steady circles while patients watched television nearby. He did not look at me when he spoke, and I did not look at him. In a low, even voice, he told me that every morning at 5:50, a shift change created an 11-minute gap in live surveillance coverage. During the handover, 3 camera zones went dark simultaneously, including the hallway outside the records office on sublevel 1. He said he had personally seen folders labeled with my name in that office's filing cabinet during his maintenance rounds. He could not go back inside himself. Staff had already started watching him more carefully. The decision had to be mine. 11 minutes. Sublevel 1. Records office. Gray filing cabinet against the left wall. I spent the rest of that day memorizing every detail. I traced the route in my mind so many times that by evening, I could walk it with my eyes closed and never hesitate at a single turn. I moved at 5:52 on a Thursday morning, 2 days after Pete gave me the route. I slipped out of my room during the surveillance gap, took the back stairwell in bare feet, and reached sublevel 1 in under 3 minutes. The records office door was unlocked. Pete had arranged it. Inside, the faint light from the corridor was enough to work by. The filing cabinet stood against the left wall, exactly as he had described. I found my name within seconds. 3 folders. I pulled them all. The first held forged psychological evaluations, dates altered by weeks, signatures from doctors I had never met, session notes describing episodes that had never occurred. The second held financial authorization forms with my forged signature on every page. The third held printed correspondence between the facility director and Uncle Warren's private attorney, dated months before my admission, beginning the same week my father's will had been read. They had been planning this from the very beginning. Then the alarm panel in the hallway let out a single sharp mechanical beep. I pressed myself flat against the wall and held every breath I had. Footsteps moved in the corridor, one set, heavy and quick. I looked at the 3 folders in my hands and knew I could not replace them and still get out in time. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. Then a voice filled the hallway. Pete's voice, deliberately raised, deliberately ordinary. I dropped a whole supply cart down here, sorry, that noise was me. A pause. Then another voice, tighter and suspicious. What are you doing on sublevel 1 at this hour? Pete answered without rushing. He said he had come down early to restock cleaning supplies because the morning supervisor had made a specific request. His voice was steady and unhurried, the voice of a man with nothing to hide. He was pulling all the attention onto himself with nothing to gain from it. I heard him being walked away from the corridor. The footsteps faded. I had perhaps 60 seconds remaining. Pete had been watching what was happening to me since the first week. I did not waste what he gave me. Before guiding me toward the records office, Pete had pressed something small and cold into my palm during an earlier exchange. A flat USB drive no larger than my thumbnail, encased in black rubber. He had said nothing about it then, but standing inside that office with 3 folders in my hands, I understood its purpose completely. The device had a single small button on its side. I pressed it once and a tiny indicator light confirmed it was active. I worked quickly, photographing and transferring every critical page. The forged psychological evaluations. The falsified financial authorization forms. The printed correspondence between the facility director and Uncle Warren's attorney. A hidden camera access log stored in a sleeve at the back of the 3rd folder, confirming that footage from my room had been transmitted to an external private server. I replaced all 3 folders in the cabinet exactly as I had found them. When I heard footsteps returning toward the corridor, I had already pressed the drive deep into the inner hem of my waistband. I climbed back up the stairwell without a sound. 5 days after I retrieved the evidence, they came to move me. 2 staff members I had never seen before appeared in my doorway at 7 in the morning, with Nurse Caldwell standing behind them. She told me in her usual clipped tone, that I was being transferred to a higher security care unit for what she called more intensive therapeutic support. I asked where. She did not answer. I asked for the name of the facility. She said my treatment team had determined that my current placement was insufficient for my needs. I understood exactly what that meant. Someone had noticed something, a folder slightly out of alignment, a question Pete had asked during maintenance, something small that had triggered a review. A higher security ward would mean permanent isolation. No common rooms, no surveillance gaps, no maintenance workers who might slip notes into passing palms. I was given 5 minutes to gather my belongings. I picked up nothing. I already carried the only thing that mattered, pressed flat against my skin beneath my clothing, small enough to be invisible and heavy enough to bring everything down. They sedated me inside the van. I felt the needle before I saw it, a quick, cold pressure in my upper arm while Nurse Caldwell leaned across and spoke to the other staff member in a voice too low to catch. The sedative moved fast. I focused hard on staying anchored, the texture of the van seat under my palms, the license plate of a car we passed, the color of a traffic light. I slipped under for what felt like a few minutes and came back in slow, thin layers. When my vision cleared enough to be useful, I looked out the window and tried to recognize the streets. We were on a downtown route. I knew the shape of the blocks, the old brick post office on the corner, the familiar pattern of the intersections. Then 2 blocks ahead I saw it. The stone columns and wide front steps of the county courthouse, catching the morning sun directly. We were going to pass within 30 feet of it. My hands had not been restrained. The window beside me was not fully latched. The van slowed to a stop at a red traffic light directly across from the courthouse entrance. Nurse Caldwell was facing forward. The second staff member was reading through a clipboard, head down. My hands had not been restrained during this transfer, a small oversight that now felt enormous. I pressed my fingers against the edge of the window and pushed upward. Gave not far but enough. I did not let myself stop to think. I found the door release lever, pressed it, and stepped out onto the pavement in bare feet, while the light was still red. I walked, not ran, straight toward the courthouse steps. Running would attract immediate pursuit. Walking gave me seconds that running would not. I heard a shout from the van behind me, then a second voice. I did not turn around. I took the courthouse steps 2 at a time and pushed through the heavy glass entrance doors. A security guard near the metal detector looked up sharply. I stopped, stood straight, and said 3 words clearly enough for everyone in the lobby to hear. I need help. A courthouse clerk named June reached a referral attorney within minutes of my arrival. When I gave my name, Ivy Cade, and mentioned my father, George Cade of Cade Investment Group, the attorney paused and made a single quiet call. 20 minutes later, Stuart Clifton walked through the side door of the waiting room. My father's lawyer. The man who had read the will that October afternoon and watched my uncle's face go blank. He looked older. He sat across from me and I placed the USB drive on the table between us without a word. I told him everything, the forged admission papers, the staged family dinner, the hidden camera in my room, the correspondence between the facility director and Uncle Warren's attorney that I had recovered from the records office. He listened without interrupting once. When I finished, he picked up the drive and turned it over in his hand. Then he looked at me steadily. "I've been waiting for you to find a way out," he said quietly. He filed an emergency legal motion that same afternoon. The filings hit the court system like a stone through glass. Stuart submitted an emergency motion for a competency review, along with the full contents of the USB drive, the forged psychological evaluations, the falsified financial forms, the internal correspondence, and the hidden camera access log. The court ordered a freeze on all asset transfers connected to my name within 48 hours. By the 3rd day, 2 financial news outlets had picked up the story. By the 5th day, it was everywhere. Cade Investment Group's stock dropped sharply as investors reacted to the fraud exposure. Uncle Warren's attorney issued a statement calling the evidence fabricated, but the file metadata contradicted him. Dates, credentials, and letterheads that all matched exactly. My mother issued no statement at all. She simply stopped answering her phone. Tara Fields contacted Stuart's office and offered to cooperate with investigators. A judge signed warrants for Uncle Warren, the facility director, and 2 medical professionals within the week. The structure they had built to silence me was now collapsing loudly, in full public view, under the weight of its own lies. I stood in the courtroom on a cold November morning, 6 weeks after they had dragged me down my own front steps in bare feet. I wore clean clothes. My hands were free. Stuart Clifton stood beside me. Across the aisle, Uncle Warren sat with a hastily hired attorney. He tried to speak twice during the hearing. Both times, the judge asked him to wait while she reviewed the submitted evidence. My mother sat 3 rows behind him and never once raised her eyes from her hands. When the judge delivered her ruling, she read each line without pausing. Full restoration of my legal competency, full restoration of my controlling shares in Cade Investment Group, freezing of all transferred assets, and referral of all evidence to the District Attorney's Office for criminal proceedings. I did not cry. I did not look at my uncle or my mother. I simply stood still and listened to every word. Outside the courthouse, I stood alone on the front steps in the cold morning air. They had tried to erase me. All they managed to do was reveal themselves.